I am absolutely thrilled to be sitting here with someone who I've been very interested in some time, been following this individual known as the Black Horse. Now, the Black Horse is the creator of a Substack that I've got a lot of interest in right now called the Red Ensign, which is at theredensign.substack.com. That deals primarily with deeper Canadian history and Canadian identity, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he's also the CEO of the Beowulf Foundation, which can be found at beowulf.foundation. And you can also find him on Twitter at the Black Horse, where you can find all his most recent updates. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with me.
Yeah, thank you for that kind introduction. I I'm a smaller profile in this space, but intentionally so. So it's good to see that I've had. It's good to see some interest.
He's a good old fashioned Canadian boy. And before we get started, we haven't really talked much about the Beowulf Foundation on this show before. I've been aware of it, and we're aware of the Shieldings event, but I was wondering if you wanted to take the time and maybe just summarize for people who don't know what the Beowulf Foundation is, what you do, and what people might be familiar with but not know it's you.
Yeah, so the Beowulf Foundation is an umbrella organization designed to facilitate for the what I would say the political movements associated with the intellectual work going on the sort of on the dissident right. So we've done a couple of things. We created some alt tech solutions during the period when Discord was pretty aggressively censoring. We set up the Shieldings events, and we're currently looking to expand from just political conferences to art and mythology events as well. So you should be seeing some of that in the next year from us. And we've got some other pieces. We built the basket weaving communities. So basket weaving is a euphemism for connecting in real life with like-minded people. The intent is to kind of grow basket weaving into local networks that will be valuable in the years to come. So those are kind of the three projects that are out there already. And then there are a couple of things going on in the background to try to build more infrastructure for people in this space.
And if people are wondering, I joined basket weaving myself, so Dimes did it.
There you
Why
go.
aren't you? And I've gotten a nice welcome so far. Even a couple of people who know the show, and even a couple of those couples said, "Good job on the show." Yeah, so I some people are aware of the Shieldings events. That I think there's one coming up in Nashville soon. Is that?
Yeah, in a couple of weeks. So
Yes.
if you want to go over and buy a ticket, I think there's a few tickets left, but I think they're pretty close to sold out. So if you want to do that, you better do it.
All right. Now, I'm curious to hear a bit more about yourself. I know we're very conscious about not doxing anyone on here, but very few people recently in our space seem to be approaching the Canadian identity question with any real vigor. Maybe we might have seen it a few years ago. There used to be a lot of podcasts that just kind of went away, and a lot of people who were talking about this thing called like the Red Ensign movement, but then kind of went away. I'm curious about you, and as general terms as you could give, sort of what's your background? What made you kind of approach Canadian identity this way from more of the, I suppose, the British perspective? And just what's your story on why you've taken up this cause?
Yeah, so there's layers to this. First of all, I'm a greater than seventh generation Canadian, so I can't actually trace beyond that, but I can trace 7 generations of my family on both sides that have inhabited this 200 square mile piece of real estate in southern Ontario. So I have a personal connection to the Canada that existed before Canada was wiped away the last time. So there's a kind of personal motivation there. But the second motivation is that I I think as the ability of the sort of global liberal empire to deliver material prosperity starts to decline, and we can all feel it declining right now, um, there's a need uh, to there's a process going on called that I call retribalization, uh, which means that people are going to start retreating from these giant patronage networks that are the national states we all live in, and start retreating into smaller patronage networks that are more tightly tied in terms of identity. And you can see this. You can see this going on in the way that people consume information. They're consuming information less and less from sort of official sources and more from sources that are their own networks that have their own friend enemy distinctions. And so it's caused me to think a great deal about uh, what kind of communities are possible in Canada. And, you know, I'm not sure that it's possible to recover a pre-American Canadian identity. I don't know whether it's possible, but I thought that a couple of things were true. First of all, it's worth reflecting on the virtues of the people that formed this nation before us. Um, you know, there were a whole collection of them that were incredibly admirable, and it's worth reflecting on that as an intellectual exercise. Second, the history of how they were um, dispossessed is a really valuable history to study, because you have like a total circulation of elite that occurs in Canada, first in the 19th century and then in the 70s. And circulations of elite that are relatively peaceful are not that common. And so there's real value in kind of studying them and presenting them as case studies. And third, I think so we can talk a little bit more about the status of the modern Canadian state, but even if the modern Canadian state is irrecoverable, there's still this group of people with this common history, this common culture and bond of heritage that are going to need to make it in the world somehow. And I don't particularly want my culture to be erased. I don't want my people to be erased. So I looked around and noticed that there are a number of people who have been dispossessed of their place, and famously there's a small Middle Eastern people who have been who were dispossessed of their place for 1800 years, and yet they're still with us. And so what do? Well, they have things that are just for them, and they have this kind of deep-seated sense of who they are. And they have this really strong kind of in-group preference in networks that cross borders. And so the Red Ensign project is kind of focused on those elements. It's very early days. You called it My Substack, but the intent is for it to be a contributing publication. So you see, of the first 3 articles, there's a contributed article there already, and I'm hoping to have several more as we kind of go along.
Oh, I think I saw Skeptical Waves in there as well. That's a guy I'm familiar with.
He's part of the network, yes.
No, I encourage people to check that out. And there's a few things you touched on there that I found very interesting. And I just wanted to also say that this is something we've discussed on the show before, not only on the show, but in our sister site called the Vanguardist Journal. And one of the early, maybe the first article I published on there, they're all written by me, was about kind of creating this new idea of Canadian nationalism. Like, first of all, what is nationalism? How do we define it? And then how can we create sort of a new form of Canadian identity that is tied to the past? Because I think a lot of people recognize that there's at the very least a germ of a Canadian identity that everyone's aware of. They know, even liberals hate the idea of being American.
they know it enough to hate it, right?
Yeah,
they know it enough to pull down all the flags.
Yeah, it's weird. It's that they're aware of the Canadian identity, but they also don't want to be known as Americans. So they're stuck in this limbo where they hate who they are, but they hate becoming anything else. But the thing is, we're always asking like, okay, what can the new sort of Canadian nationalism be? And I think that Canada represents certain opportunities that are not presented. And first, I use the word nationalism. In a lot of people would think that's even like a 20th century sort of idea. Like I'm arguing, sort of more vague and abstract, like group dynamics. It doesn't need to
Well,
be traditional nationalism. But
that's what I was getting at. Like the byline of the introduction to the Substack is Canada a people, not a post-national state, which means it's an emphasis on the nation in sort of the 18th or 19th century conception, rather than the nation in the sense of the nation state.
yeah, and that's something we written about on the article in the journal before, about this idea of the nation more as this like generative force. It's not just bureaucratic boundaries, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of
Well,
nationalism.
I mean, was there a Jewish nation for the 1800 years in which Israel was not run as a Jewish state?
And that's what's interesting when you read these old texts from centuries ago. When they use the word nation, they use it to refer to this people, and that the laws and customs and the kind of the metaphysical structure that travels with that people. So even pulled from the national boundaries, they would still recognize like there's this thing called a nation that's beyond just like a tribe and beyond just like a family. Like there's a graduation there. So, and it's only recently where people kind of got twisted up.
Well, I mean,
But
for how many years did people talk about the Irish nation when there was no Irish state? Uh,
precisely.
so this is not a unique phenomena. It's not unique in history that Canadians find themselves in this position where um, there's this kind of the state that we once called our nation state, very clearly doesn't belong to us. And so, what next?
One thing I was going to get at was one thing that I think is unique about Canada that presents certain opportunities compared to, let's say, the United States. Because the United States, similar size landmass, a bit smaller, but it's very, very hospitable, very temperate. There's a great biodiversity in terms of nature, not in terms of the people, but biodiversity in America. There's something almost uniquely hostile about the Canadian landscape that I think works in a lot of, let's call them, old stock Canadians' favor. And the reason I say that is because I was reading a couple articles recently, basically about refugees and immigrants complaining about Canada.
Yeah.
One was they felt like they were sold an economic bill of goods. They say it's not as
Yes.
it's not as easy as here as we thought. And then also they
Yeah.
hate the temperature. Everyone, most people, if they're aware of the Canadian distribution of the population, a lot of it hugs that southern border. But a lot of what we might call old stock Canadians, they're dispersed further north. They're dispersed in the places that are, you need to be a Canadian to like and traverse them. It's very outdoorsy. If you're not an outdoorsy person, you're not going to fucking like it here. You have to have a pretty good relationship with nature just for it to make sense. And I think that hostility might work in our
Well,
favor long term.
one of the interesting things about Canada is that there's a history of back migration where people come here and then they leave because so like in Canada, in Toronto, which is the largest city in Canada, there's this long history of Italian Canadian slums in Toronto. But where did all these people go? Well, if you actually like study the ethnography, a lot of them went back to Italy. Most of them went to the United States because they came here at a time when in like the late 19th, early 20th century, when things were pretty bad, especially in southern Italy. But it turns out that there's a lot easier places to make a living than in the Great White North. So
Yeah. And what's interesting is, once again, that presents certain opportunities to Canadians because a lot of people have remarked that there's a lot of content creators from Canada. What's that about? Not just in our scene, but generally, there's way more famous content creators, broadcasters, and whatnot from this relatively lower population country than you would expect. And one of the reasons given was that Canada just doesn't have the same entertainment infrastructure, forcing people to kind of do it themselves. There's
yeah.
more of a preponderance of independent media here, which kind of
Yeah.
amplifies over time because we don't have MTV. We have to get
Well,
shit
not only
imported.
do we not have MTV, we also don't have Fox News, right? So
Yeah.
if you have any non-hyper progressive opinions, it's like impossible to watch CBC or something.
Yeah. So
Um,
unless you're the type of person who's willing to rub two sticks together, then it's you're going to have a hard time here. You have to work a bit harder to get everything from consumer packaged goods, groceries to
yeah,
decent internet. Everything kind of sucks a bit more, and maybe that's a good filter.
yeah. Well, especially as Canada kind of appears to get poorer, um, you know, a little hardship. It'll hurt some people, but maybe it's not such a bad thing.
There's a lot of Canadians getting into food prep and cooking at home, and because everything's you cannot survive if you're not smart on food here. It's just like the
Yeah,
grocery bills are going to rape you, and
yeah,
I say it like I use the term rape a lot. I'm always getting raped by concepts.
right.
However, that's one for sure. If you're Canadians, like that's I hear this every week from my wife. It's like, how did we spend this much money? We just bought vegetables. I'm like, I know. We should
Yeah.
just eat meat, but then she.
You should exclusively eat bison, like the great Canadian ancestors.
Yeah, like this is the whole Michaela Peterson grift. But maybe she was onto something. Maybe
Yeah,
we just eat beef
yeah.
every day.
Return to pemmican, right?
Yeah, it turns out that the of all the words of tongue and pen, the saddest are Jordan Peterson was right again.
Uh,
You had mentioned an interesting thing at the start when you're talking about the circulation of elites. You had mentioned one circulation in the 70s and one prior to that. I was wondering if you could clarify that a little bit for people who don't know.
yeah. So Canada, most people are kind of vaguely aware that Canada began kind of as a compact between two peoples, uh, a British, a group of British settlers and a group of French Canadian settlers who were exchanged in a colonial war in the 18th century. Most people aren't aware that the sort of founding seed of the British settlers in Canada were refugees after the Americans or after the American War of Independence. So British loyalists during the War of Independence were pretty severely persecuted, uh, and after the British pulled out of New York, they resettled. They bought a large tract of land in what's now Ontario, and resettled some of these people in Acadia, and resettled some of these people in Ontario, and put them into a colonial unit with the French Canadians. And this was sort of the beginning of what we now call Canada. In the years that followed, there developed a very explicitly British colonial elite that ruled the colony, and there were two pieces to this elite that kind of mirrored the two political parties back in Britain. There was a dominant piece which was associated with the conservative party back in Britain, which was hyper imperialist, hyper colonial. And you can understand why on the frontier they would become the dominant political force, even when they weren't always the dominant political force back in the UK. And then there was a sort of there was a piece of the colonial elite that mirrored the Liberal Party back in the UK. But the problem with this political affiliation in the colonial world was that there's no power dividend to it, because if you're like an imperialist, you can lean back on the networks of imperialist power and finance back in the old country. But if you're an anti-imperialist in a settler colony, there's no lines of power. So for basically the entire 19th century, Canada was dominated by this British um, this British imperialist elite with quite strong ties back to the UK. And I've written about some of these figures. Lord Strathcona is probably the kind of the emblematic figure of this. He got his start in the Hudson's Bay Company, which was headquartered in London, but all of its money was made trading furs and sort of basic supplies to the remote peoples scattered through sort of what's now northern Canada. And so he got his start there, and then he made all of his money in distributing. Again, most people wouldn't know this, but the Hudson's Bay Company um, controlled territory which would now be like the third largest country in the world. The Hudson's Bay property was actually larger than the United States of
Yeah,
America.
I remember learning that in high school when we were doing Canadian history. If was that called Rupert's Land or was that something else?
Well, Rupert's Land was the core of it, but there were other properties that they had as well.
Yeah, basically, so much of Canada was just owned by this company. And for people who don't know, who are non-Canadians, like the Hudson's Bay Company still exists to this day as, one of the only department stores left.
Yeah, it's kind of, well, it became a department store really in the early 20th century, because in these remote communities it was the everything store. So if you wanted manufactured goods, you would go to the Hudson's Bay Trading Post. You would sell whatever product you have in your remote location, and you would buy, famously blankets, but also like everything that you needed to live in the middle of goddamn nowhere. Um, but in the 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Hudson's Bay Company distributed all this land that it owned. Most of it was distributed in a single act of parliament in the UK, but the parts of the land which were considered valuable were sold off to the railroad industry. So Alexander Smith ran an inside-outside game with the Canadian government as they were trying to build railroads going westward, where he would, on the one hand, own large chunks of the land through the Hudson's Bay Company, on the other hand, use his influence in Parliament to make sure that the railroad went over the tracts of land that he owned and therefore had to buy it from him. So you can see Canadian politics has not changed all that much in 150 years in terms of mechanics, but certainly, I mean, this is a guy who privately financed and raised a regiment to go fight in South Africa in the Boer War. So it's the kind of belief in he was British in a way that British people aren't British anymore.
Yeah, in your article, I believe that's Lord Strathcona's horse embarking
Yes.
on South. There's right near the end there's an image of it as well.
Yeah, well, I also include one of the, I love including these images from late 19th century Canada because it's a reminder of what late 19th century Canada looked like.
Yeah, there's so much of Canadian history that is like hand in glove with nature as well. Like a lot of these photos are very, very rugged looking. And, when you talk to a lot of the Canadian identitarian people, like this is like, a lot of American identitarians will harken back to like the 1960s, 1950s, sort of the post-war era as their ideal time. For Canadians, you're going back to like 1841.
Yeah, it's like and for most of that history, Canada as a nation, like nobody in 1930 Canada believed that Canada was a country. There's a tiny group of people who believed that Canada was and should be a country at that time. The overwhelming majority of people believed that Canada was an element of the British Empire, and that was their kind of primary identity.
That's an interesting way to look at it because in America, you had, one of the books we covered on the show was The True History of the American Revolution. And there's a part kind of near the end that dealt with Canada. Of course, Britain was involved in the American Revolution, and Canada by proxy was involved too. And I believe it was Samuel Adams in his writings. They're always trying to get Canadians involved. They're always trying to get people because there's always dissidents around, but they were trying to kind of rise the rancor in Canadians and issue different types of propaganda just to see what worked, and it never did. And I think he famously claimed that Canadians just lacked a revolutionary spirit. That was his word.
Yeah.
But I'm like, maybe. I mean, because revolution was in the air at the time during the French Revolution, so revolution was this cool thing that for whatever reason Canadians lacked. But once you look at what Canada was, like it wasn't a homogenous nation. It wasn't even a nation in the process of becoming. We didn't really get there until like 1940. I'm trying to think of when
Yeah.
the flag. I was just reading earlier today.
Well, that's all the '60s. That's all the quote invention of Canada period.
Yeah,
Uh,
and you had some interesting thoughts on the invention of Canada period as well. I guess that would be the destruction in essence, or the destruction of the spirit of this Canada that we're talking about now.
yeah, it's the circulation of elites to replace the British elites with the American elites. And to be clear, in my earlier comment, the circulation of elites I was discussing was the replacement of French Canadian elites. Because there's an older Canada, which is French Canada, with the British aristocracy, um, and that was pretty heavy-handed. The colony was conquered, and then all these refugees were resettled here, and then everyone who was allowed to be in power was a believer in the British Empire.
Yeah.
Um,
So was the British takeover more economic and industrialist in a sense? Like it was just purely just business related, or was it
uh,
something else, do you think?
well, the takeover by the British. So the French exchanged Quebec, which was the name of the French Canadian colony, to the British Empire for some possessions in the Caribbean. So um, the the French Canadian settlers in Quebec were kind of sold out in that regard. And then uh, when you're in a colony of the British Empire, the only people who are really allowed to be in charge of anything are British imperialists.
I just want to do
So,
I can't do a Donald Trump voice, but I want to do, it was the worst trade in the history of trades.
and then, but the 1960s is a very different kind of takeover. So that's a circulation of elites from the sort of British elite to the, well, Canada gets uh, conquered by what are now called the Laurentian Elite, which are um, partly French Canadian, partly American, but they very much are believers in. They're believers in two things. They're believers in the French Canadian ethno state, and they're believers in Americanism as a mechanism for ruling Anglo Canada.
That's an interesting combination because I think a lot of Canadians who are listening will be aware of the French Quebecois, ethno nationalism. It's one of the few places, like a lot of Canadian identitarians will look to Quebec and say, look, they got rules about language and arguably
Well,
ethnicity.
Quebec is probably it's one of the last ethno states in the Western world, maybe the last, but uh, Quebec is ruled even today explicitly for the benefit of a specific ethnicity.
Exactly. And to the point where, and we've talked about this on the show, where they have like language rules. They do almost like a jizya tax where if you don't speak French, almost exclusively, you just have to pay a tax. And then they make it hostile for people who want to live there and not speak French. And this Laurentian elite, where would you say their status is in sort of the overall Canadian rankings? Are they near the top? Are they kind of the
Well,
top guys?
so the Laurentian elite have two parts. They have a Franco-Canadian ethno-nationalist element, and they have like an American progressive shitlip element. Uh, and these two items coexist in this really strange relationship, but often coexist in the same people. So if you look at the figure of Pierre Trudeau, who's kind of the emblematic head of the French Canadian of the Laurentian elite, um, he both believed in a French Canadian, almost national socialist state, and believed in like uh, bringing down the progressive vision from the 19th century on the rest of Canada.
Well, and I noticed the same, and maybe not to the same degree, but I noticed similar, you know, attributes in Justin Trudeau, where like here is another strong French Canadian identity who is the leader of progressivism, maybe in the or wants to be rather. I shouldn't say he is.
Yeah.
He desperately wants to be like a Joe Biden level. He'll never get there though. But like I see. Do you think that a Justin Trudeau would still harbor that sort of agenda?
Yeah. So in the period since the 70s, uh, this elite, there have been growing tensions between these two elements within that elite. And uh, if you watch Justin Trudeau in his relationship with Quebec, you can see this because kind of the ethno-nationalist elements in Quebec politics um, really struggle with his migration agenda. So uh, there's, I would expect that there will be a fracture in this coalition. Uh, at the moment, that fracture is papered over by the mutual desire to take lots of money from Western Canada and dump it in Quebec.
That's it, because that's another thing that I noticed over time. Because even when I was younger, they would talk about the haves and the have-not provinces, which was an official designation for people who don't know. And everyone would always say, "There's all this money flowing into Quebec. What's going on with that?" And this is sad to say the first time I'd really heard anyone speak of the Laurentian elite or this core group. Now, would you say it's kind of the legacy of the Trudeaus, or are there other? Is this really like a formed group that you would say like you can point
Yeah,
to?
it's a very specific group of people, and they run a great deal of Canadian business. So one of the things you'll notice if you look at Canadian non-bank businesses, um, you'll notice that a vast proportion of their revenues are directly or indirectly subsidized by the government. So if you look at a company like Bombardier, for example, there's no world in which Bombardier is a viable business without government contracts, and there's no world in which they get government contracts on an equal basis. Uh, so, and you'll see this with all the corruption scandals that have come out from the current Trudeau government, the many corruption scandals. They're all predicated on funneling federal money into this collection of businesses that have been around Canada for a very long time, that are all run by this, group of people that live in the Montreal-Ottawa corridor.
That's fascinating. I wonder if there's any overlap with them. And this is something we're going to cover on the show, which this interview will air on, with sort of the Chinese infiltration, not just of the West Coast, which everyone's familiar with, but really a good chunk of Canadian businesses right around the Ontario core as well. And this might be too far afield of a question, but do you detect any sort of uh, business relationship between the Laurentian elite and perhaps the CCP or Chinese elites?
I mean, there's an admiration there. The Laurentian elite have watched what the CCP has done in China and think that that's the right way to run a country. So there's an admiration there at one level for sure. The CCP certainly like the Laurentian elite in that they're willing to finance them. So if you look at present Canadian politics, you'll notice that there are repeated scandals related to what is termed in the media of as Chinese influence in Canadian politics. In reality, they're talking about Chinese money supporting liberal politicians, basically.
And that's something we talked about on the last episode as well. And we're going to develop a bit further. The last episode was sort of the CCP infiltration. This episode, it's more the CCP working hand in glove with the triads, the organized crime element. And they're pretty much one and the same, and how that dark money circulates. But that one aspect we came across is when people talk about political infiltration, it's like, no, you have to understand, we're talking about MPs being elected. And that's really like how does China start electing MPs? Well, that's where you get the real estate purchases. Like, it's not even
Yeah.
that difficult to chart the course for how you get that.
Yeah, no, it's very unsubtle. One of the things that's interesting about Canadian politics is that a lot of the things that go on here also go on other places, but they're very naked here. The Laurentian Elite, they're not like careful about covering their tracks, which is why their corruption scandals are constantly in the news, even though the news is like state owned.
It's funny, even I think it was Richard Fadden, the former head of CSIS. He comes out and says, "Look, I know at least two MPs that are bought and sold by the Chinese Communist Party, and we got at least 200 Canadian companies that are owned by the Chinese Communist Party." And then
Yeah,
he gets called in front of the House of Commons and called racist. And it's like so you and what you notice is
yeah.
also the whole, and not to spend too much time on the China thing, but it to your point, people are generally aware. You will hear liberal, even centrist newspapers mention like, "Yep, China owns half of Vancouver," and then everyone's
Yeah.
like, "Yeah, what are we going to do about it?" Everyone kind of knows, but no one does anything.
Well, that's the thing that's really interesting about Canadian politics. It's so naked, but there's nothing. There's until very recently there have been no mechanisms available to do anything about it.
And one thing we had discussed on the show, and this is kind of on an earlier point I said, where certain opportunities present themselves to Canadians. I think what the trucker protest, the anti-COVID protest proved, I'm like, Canada wishes it was a bit more of a police state. It just isn't, because it lacks that infrastructure. So there's a lot of things I bet they would love to do, but they can't do it.
So emblematic of this is the attempt by the Ford government in Ontario to impose martial law during COVID lockdown. So most people aren't aware of this, but the Ford government came out and announced publicly that they wanted to introduce checkpoints and like mandatory police stops for you to go anywhere. And you'd basically have to show your justification for why you were leaving your house. And the response from the Ontario Provincial Police was, we're not going to do that. And they couched it in, that would be an inappropriate imposition into civil liberties. But if you just look at it, the actual reason they didn't do this is because they would need like 10 to 100 times the manpower that they actually have in order to put something credible up.
Yeah, and that's one thing we were talking about at the time. Whereas if you look at what they're saying, they would love to bring the hammer down on these people, but there's not enough. It's almost like Canada is like America during the American Revolution. Like, they just don't have enough boots on the ground to stop these people. Now, maybe that changes. But I don't think it can, because one thing we know about Canadian infrastructure is it's not getting any better with time. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, the real issue for them is they have no significant military and no large police force. Could they get a significant military or a significant police force? Maybe. But those things cost a lot of money, and you're not going to do that overnight. So they've got a legal infrastructure for a police state. They certainly have enough power to come and like bring the hammer down on you individually, but they have no. I mean, Canada's been such a peaceful place for so long. They have no infrastructure or even sort of intellectual approach for how they think they might deal with unrest. So, like, one of the things I've gamed out repeatedly is what happens if, the group of people who control the Western provinces in Canada decide that they want out. Well,
That's kind of what's happening right now, too, unless there was just an election held, and I'm going to show my ass on this one, but I
yeah,
think there was just an election held in Manitoba, Alberta, yeah, where they're talking about sort of a Western coalition against Ottawa, I think, right?
yeah. So this is something I've tracked fairly carefully because I think it has profound implications for the way the country is governed. So, as I alluded to earlier, the thing that keeps the peace in the Laurentian elite between the Franco nationalists and the sort of progressives is the mutual desire to loot the to loot the wealth of Western Canada, and they do this to the tune of billions of dollars every year, and they also impose these quite draconian strictures to prevent the Western Canadian elite from doing their business, which is oil, agriculture, yeah, principally oil and agriculture, also some mining of various kinds. But what they've done is they've used Environment Canada and the relationship with the Native American client groups to make it very difficult for them to do their business and produce this money, which has produced uh, a lot of discontent among the Western Canadian elites.
Well,
This
that's it.
discontent.
You mentioned the Aboriginals and the native tribes there. Just to have a quick tangent, where their position in this entire matrix, would they be kind of working with or for the Laurentian elite to propel
Their
their
client
interests?
their client groups. So the best way to understand Native Americans in terms of their position in Canadian politics is they're the Canadian equivalent of like African Americans.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of listeners of the show who will be nodding along to that. And a lot of people who have noticed when they see Aboriginal groups kind of forwarding their purposes, they seem to be puppeted by something else because a lot of the times it seems disjointed or even not in their interests. Um,
Well, because these people are paid like millions of dollars directly by the federal government and so there's a lot of leverage there.
and I had one question. So everything you're saying makes complete sense, but to a lot of listeners, it might seem counterintuitive that they're trying to loot the West, but also make these impositions on how they do business and how they generate that money. Is there a big ideological tilt to them, or is it just they're trying to make them
Well,
suffer?
I mean, preventing them from making their money is ideological. Looting them is not ideological, as far as I can tell. So, turn in progressive world, agriculture and resource extraction are bad, and so we can't let that happen. But also, we would like the money that you generate from agriculture and from extractive industry. So, uh,
Now, I
these
wonder. Sorry, I was going to continue. Actually, sorry, I interrupted you.
so like these contradictions are the reasons um, why the Laurentian elite is becoming less coherent and losing control.
And that's what I was going to ask, because a lot of people will be able to track the truth of this by the simple fact that you see these people doing these things. But I was wondering, and this might be too large of a question, but do we know their long term strategy? It does seem to be becoming less coherent, and the inertia of this entire group seems to be flying apart. Do you know if there's any sort of grand scheme for this
Uh, well,
small group?
I think the Laurentian elite have some really serious problems, and I don't think that they have any idea of how they're going to solve them. Um,
Like Trudeau, it's like you look at him and you're like, he doesn't really make a lot of sense, and that's why one of the largest arguments I had in favor of this group existing, which is like, you have to explain to me how Justin Trudeau gets there, because no one really likes him. Even liberals don't like him that much. He's this weird. He's an oddity on the global stage, but also in Canadian politics. But I'm like, someone's got to explain why he's there, if not the machinations of some other group,
well, I mean, I can't do this because of my position, but I can, like, it's straightforward to draw a line between Justin Trudeau and the people who put him at the head of the federal Liberal Party. You might remember that the federal Liberal Party during the period of conservative reign under Stephen Harper desperately struggled to find a leader that could put the Liberal Party coalition together and unseat the hated Westerners. The Conservative Party in Canada, for those who don't know, is the political embodiment of the Western Canadian elite. So
Okay. That's a
the
better way to frame it. I've never heard it framed that way. So I've always only heard it expressed ideologically, but not geographically. So the
no
conservatives would be Westerns.
all Canadian politics is geographic. All the ideological elements are just kind of impositions on top. So you might notice that when Stephen Harper was in charge of Canada, absolutely nothing happened that was ideologically conservative. But many things happened that benefited Western Canada.
Interesting. So we have the Western and we have the Central. Would the Maritimes and the Eastern really have no seat at the table then, would you say?
Yeah, neither BC nor the Maritimes have a seat at the table in Canadian politics.
And then the North might as well just be
Well, there's
Barbaricum.
nobody lives there. It's
Yeah. That's interesting. So, really, the best way to frame Canadian politics is East versus West, with the current Laurentian elite in charge. Is there, in your mind, perhaps a Western counterbalance elite that exists right now?
Yeah, so there's a Western elite that exists that has its draws its power from the money that it's able to generate from resource extraction and from agricultural industries. Um, these are the people who finance the truck convoy. They use the truck convoy to decapitate the leadership of the political parties that they control. The three conservative parties in the Western provinces and the Conservative Party of Canada, all of which happened almost immediately when the truck convoy existed. You can see their political action in their political battle with the Laurentian elite, in the kind of struggle to build pipelines, very clearly. So,
Yeah.
and you can see their political embodiment right now in the Manitoba First Act, the Alberta Sovereignty Act, um, which are all very explicit messages to Ottawa indicating that the status quo is unacceptable. And so, from my point of view, either the Laurentian elite are going to, either they're going to, the Western elite are going to be shut out of power in Ottawa, in which case they'll have to resolve their grievances through separatist politics, or you're going to see Trudeau go down, and um, you're going to see a containment cycle in Canadian politics. One of the two is going to happen.
And I know this is too much speculation and perhaps a hypothetical we don't want to go down, but which of those two do you think is more likely? Because to my mind, maybe I'm way off on this, but I detect some fatigue with Trudeau. Like I'm not sure even has the same internal support as he once had. And do you think that's true, or do you see really the Liberals still maintaining their power, and then maybe we do go to separatist politics?
I do detect some fatigue with him. It's hard to say because I'm not strongly connected with the coalition that kind of put him in power. At least I'm less strongly connected to it than I would have been 5 years ago, just interpersonally. Um, so it's because it's not the case that general sentiment in the areas where people like you and I tend to live and spend our time has any connection to the probability of Justin Trudeau being reelected.
Yeah.
I mean, the riding in which I presently reside will probably go from voting 70% for the Conservative Party to voting like 85% for the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
But
Over the past few years, I've seen a lot more anti-Trudeau sentiment, and we've remarked on the show, it's very often on our side. We complain about people complaining about the wrong thing. So we might say, okay, you're anti-Trudeau, but are you anti-liberal policy? That typical shit. But
yeah,
to your point, I am noticing a lot more open hostility towards Trudeau. You're seeing more bumper stickers. You're seeing people who were never politically active being more outspoken against him. And so I think that translates to something.
yeah. I mean, it certainly translates to something. I don't know whether it translates to electoral politics or not. I mean, at the moment, it translates to like every day. If you drive through the streets of 905, you'll see people like waving giant, F Trudeau flags everywhere, um, which is a sentiment I broadly agree with. But I'm not sure what political value that really has.
Yeah, on our show,
I don't know.
we've staked a very far line of like people aren't radical enough. I won't repeat some of the stuff we've thought before, but the trucker protest, we're like, you had a good thing, you should have kept going. But
Yeah.
the what I was going to say was, where, in your opinion, does the People's Party of Canada fall in all of this? Do you think that's just an unimportant flashpoint, or do you think that's representative of something else?
So they represent, the last people who believe in ideological politics in Canada, right? So Bernier actually believes in that Canada should be governed better than it does. than it is. Not he doesn't believe in one region or another or represent a particular interest group. He believes Canada should be well governed. Uh, he's probably the only person in Canadian politics who thinks that it's important that Canada is well governed, um, which is a credit to him personally. But you know, I don't think it has the place that it has in politics is that it may compel the nominally conservative party to govern with some more nods towards actual conservatism.
That's what we were talking about. That you have these, I don't want to call them fringe parties, but more ideologically driven parties tend to be absorbed over time into the main sort of regional ones. So I'm like, you very well may see conservatives take more of an anti-COVID approach, maybe take something approaching identity politics, but I'm like, well, that'll take the wind out of the sails out of the PPC. I will say for the record, I was an early advocate of the PPC. I was like one of the first
Yeah,
guys
I
who
mean
joined.
they're a great, like, if you're a Canadian with actual conservative values, it's a great thing that the PPC exists, because it will compel the Conservative Party to at least pretend to be conservative for a few minutes.
Let
Um,
me ask you this, and I'm sure not throwing too much political
but
stuff at you, but I am
but if
curious.
I just take a step back here, I'm actually not all that interested in uh, ideological politics in Canada. I think that the country needs to be fundamentally restructured before anything, in order to avoid living in this kind of. Um, I think the country needs to fundamentally be restructured before good governance is again possible.
Now, by
And so,
restructuring, do we mean sort of a demarcation between East and West, or how would you kind of reshape it in that sense?
well, I think the best hope for getting that outcome is for the system of transfer payments from West to Quebec that keeps the Laurentian elite together to break down. And that can break down either via Western separatism, or it can break down through the excesses of environmentalism. Um, because either you'll have the West leave and then you can't loot their money anymore, which means that Quebec will leave, or you can so strangle the sources of revenue out West that there isn't enough money to be extracted in the looting operation to convince the Franco nationalists that they belong with the rest of the country.
What's
So,
amusing, I was about to refer to them as the welfare elite, but then I started thinking, well, that is traditionally what the aristocracy and the elite were. It's kind of a modern phenomenon where you have this independently wealthy capitalist elite. But
yeah, no,
they're a traditional sort of aristocracy. But yeah, they are completely 100% dependent on the revenues from the people and these other companies.
that's right. They're rent seeking. And, at least in exchange for their rent, they actively pursue the interests of the people that they're supposed to be connected to. So, in that way, I admire the French Canadian elite.
So, in a sense, like we should be very interested in sort of this Western, if not total separatism, but the separatist movement and sort of the increase of that Western sovereignty. Because I think a lot of people are looking at how do we enact any sort of change in Ottawa, change in the ideological policy of Canada. Because, for the Americans or the Europeans listen, we have a lot of European listeners, like it's very tough to describe what's like living in Canada. It feels insane and a lot of dissident minded people are at a loss for what to do or why things are happening or how this all fits together. And so I think if they were looking for like a mid to short term solution, they should be looking at this perhaps from a geographic perspective and taking a more of an interest in this Western sovereignty. Would that be good to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's there's kind of two things that you should be doing if you're a Canadian who isn't like captured by the progressive mind virus. Uh, One is that you should be doing whatever it is that it's in your power to do to make sure that the this conveyor belt of money that supports the present regime breaks down. And the second is you should be figuring out how you're going to survive the next, you know, 20, 30 years as a family.
Do you have any suggestions for that? Because some people will hear that and they'll think, oh, homesteading. Some people will think more community building. Are there any areas that I know this is something the Beowulf Foundation is very concerned with, but do you have any suggestions for Canadians?
Yeah, I think the key element here is retribalization. So you're going to have an increasingly hostile system uh, coming out of the central government. It either there are going to be, as they gradually lose control of the country, it's going to they're going to be more and more rent seeking. They're going to be more and more aggressive at punishing their political enemies. Uh, you should basically think about how Mennonites live and want to live like that, right? So live in communities that can, as much as possible, ignore the central government.
You
Um,
know, there's an interesting phenomenon in Canada where when I think of great American cities, not even like the centers of capital like New York, but even like a New Orleans or something, I tend to think of these cities, these urban areas as generative from a people. But oftentimes when I think of Canadian cities, I can only view them as either centers of capital or centers of bureaucracy. And there's very few Canadian urban areas that have that, power of the people, or that folk spirit, whatever you want to call it. And the reason I say this is because a lot of people will say we should not abandon urban centers because that's cultural hubs. But is it different in Canada? Like, do you get the sense that the few Canadian cities are just there for like bureaucracy and trade?
well, I mean, first of all, they're overwhelmingly not inhabited by Canadians, except for the western ones. So that's, I mean, Montreal and Quebec are Franco cities. If I was a Franco, I might feel
Oh,
differently
yeah,
about them.
Montreal, I should say, and Quebec City are probably. I was there last year, and I would say they're the exceptions.
I was born and raised in Toronto. I'm deeply connected in that city. Um, but the point I'm trying to make is not about fleeing to the countryside specifically. It's about creating a kind of community that allows you to operate without reference to the central government, because increasingly it's going to become more and more difficult to obtain positions inside the kind of, so you're not going to be able to get patronage appointments because you're a disfavored group. Uh, you're going to have to own your businesses, and you're going to have to educate your own children without reference to you know the broader education system. So how do you do that? Well, in individual families not capable of doing either of those two things effectively, you're going to need a self-contained community where there's ideological conformity and there's friend-enemy distinction against outsiders. Um, and so that when I say you're going to have to behave like the Mennonites, it's not the tie to the land that I'm talking about. It's the friend-enemy distinction surrounding your community, and it's the assumption of responsibility for your own economic well-being as a community and for your own children.
And also another example that people might forget is that aside from the Mennonites, look at what every other community does in Canada. Look at the Chinese community. Like there's a sort
That's
of
right.
an internal consistency. We talked about this on the last episode. There's an internal consistency towards Chinese immigrants who come from mainland China that is completely alien to a lot of Canadians, to the point where um, I won't get too much into it, but the way Chinese society functions is
Well,
more intra.
there are there are very hard prohibitions against things like intermarriage and doing business with outsiders. You're highly encouraged to speak the language. You're highly encouraged to conform to the customs. They have apparently police stations where they enforce their law.
Absolutely. And they also have their own clubs because one of the things about mainland China is they have this thing called the Old 100 Names that a lot of Chinese families operate as if they are corporations already. They're kind of doing because Chinese people are actually interesting to look at about how so many of them can exist apart from the communist government and have their own parallel societies, to the point where if you are a Chinese mainland immigrant and you step off the plane in Canada, you could actually find a club with your family name on it Just
Yeah.
walk in there and there's like 20 guys giving you connections, giving you a place to look. Like you can walk into a prefab, immigration thing. Whereas like the experience for a lot of Anglos is I step off the plane in a country, I'm immediately lost. That's not their experience.
And not
They're
only am I immediately lost, every institution that I might think to look at is actually actively hostile to me.
exactly. And so a lot of identitarian types will look around and say, we just want to do what the Sikhs are doing. And it's like, well, what's interesting about Canada, and this is to your point of retribalization, I think there is an opportunity for that. And I think, like
Yep.
we had said, aside from Canada being sort of a Five Eyes member nation, I think Canada's placement in the Five Eyes spy infrastructure is kind of compromised at the moment from the reading we've been doing.
Well, it's also historic, right? So it's there from a time when Canada was a very different place than it is today. And if you look at Canada's relationship with the Five Eyes, it's very clear that the Canadian government does not is not seen as an equal among that group.
Oh, and like a last episode, and actually this episode, we're going to be talking about, especially in the 90s and the 80s, everyone was aware that Canada was infiltrated by the CCP, and there's all these controversies where Canada got caught
Yeah.
leaking data and refuses to do anything about it. So they're like, well, I would, if I were America, I would say, like, we're going to trust you less, and you're kind of in name only, aside from maybe some tech development. But Canada's had a bad history of having these sort of government-run corporations, like we've been talking about, but then that develop technology for the government that they sell to China. It's like, what
Yeah,
the fuck are you doing?
yeah, yeah. Well,
I think
anyways,
ONET was one.
but I mean, you can also see these tribal networks forming in Canada, not just among migrant groups. So, like, you can see very strong. There's a very strong Dutch Reform identity that's quite coherent in Ontario. If you go out west, there are a variety of these different communities. That's how you survive in the period that we're in now. You take less interest in mainstream society except as an extractive process, and you take more interest in your own community.
Now, I know we have to get going soon, and this has been a fantastic talk. Now, one question I wanted to end on, having said that, speaking of retribalization, sort of these Dutch communities, maybe different ethnicities, would you say that, because we're speaking of the Red Ensign and Canadian history, that perhaps a British identity should have primacy in this sort of parallel society? Or
Well,
what do you think about that?
so I think it's very unclear. So I think the Anglo-Canadian identity should exist as basically an expatriate identity, an identity for people who once had a state and no longer have a state. Um, and I think we should. I think that there should be networks for these people. Um, in the coming years. At present, these things don't exist. Um, at present, and so the question is, can they be built? And the Red Ensign and similar projects exist to see if it can be done. Because if it can't be done, then the Anglo element. So, if I look at myself personally, I'm a Reformed Christian first. I'm not an Anglo. I'm an Anglo after that. But I'd like to preserve all of my culture, not just some of it, if I can. So it's worth the time and effort to see what can be done in an environment which you would think would drive enough of these people out of the institutions to make it possible to kind of to build something.
I think that's the correct way to go about it. Because one thing, again, this is something we talked about on the Vanguardist Journal, but on the show as well. It's like, if you want to talk about identity politics at this level, it's important to actually know who you are. Like, for example, with the British identity, which I believe is crucial to the Canadian identity. People will talk every day about like destroying liberalism, destroying a lot of stuff. Then once you trace the history of liberalism and what the foundations of that are, it goes very, very deep into British identity. So you have to ask, okay, are we? It seems that if you're anti all of liberalism, you would have to completely collapse society, or are you using liberalism to
But
mean something else?
I also think you have to take ownership for the mistakes of your ancestors. I mean,
Exactly.
Canadians didn't get into this position because we did everything right.
Well, precisely, and that's the thing. That's like this is the culmination of that. So, what did we learn?
Yeah,
And the line I had said was like those who can dismantle or course correct or whatever liberalism are only the ones who have passed through it.
yeah,
And so I think those essentially the creators of liberalism are probably the only ones equipped to dismantle it, because liberalism, the reason it exports so well to non-liberal places is because they don't have the fucking tools. That's why what people talk about, oh, we're exporting homosexuality. Yeah, it's actually really easy to do because they don't have the intellectual or ideological ways to withstand it. Maybe the only
well,
people who can are the people who have real insight on it, like Canadians, maybe.
yeah. I mean, it's a similar phenomena to the fact that it's very hard to sell communism in Eastern Europe. Like, uh, all of the people who were true believers in the liberal project, who are elements of the Anglosphere, will all be dead in the next 50 years. None of them are having any children. Their families are being destroyed. Um, it's only the people who have the antibodies to this thing who are going to make it through that bottleneck in the Anglo world.
Yeah,
Uh,
and there's been people on our side who have mentioned that. A few of the science-minded guys, I know Edward Dutton talks about this, about like there
yeah,
is the sheer biological angle to this, where it's like, look, this ideology does not reproduce itself, or it can only reproduce virally. It can't actually replicate itself. Like we can replicate ourselves biologically, and it's like that's that's a bottleneck they can't pass through. you know?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're at a period here where there's a very very intense biological bottleneck that we're all facing down, and it's unclear what all of the elements of that bottleneck are going to be, but certainly not having children, uh, that's going to be a problem.
And I think it's going to hit Canada before America, because I think there's a day of reckoning where a lot of you can't sweeten the pot enough for most of the immigrants to realize that, well,
Well,
Canada's too expensive and it's too inhospitable. So you'll maybe one day just be left not with immigrants pumping in money, but the old stock people who are having families and the old stock people who aren't.
yeah. Well, and the other issue is when if the economy gets tough in Canada, the migrants will just leave.
Yeah. And that's what
Because
we're
of
experiencing
course
now.
they will. Of course they will, right? Why would they not? And if you read articles about migration in Canada, even when recruiting 1 million people a year to come here, there's enough back migration with people who come here and realize that it sucks, that the net effect is quite a bit less than it has been in previous years.
Yeah.
So
There's enough people still wearing puffer jackets in the summer. They're just permanently uncomfortable. I know it. Like I'm
yeah,
adapted to this temperature. I think it's too fucking hot right now.
yeah.
But there everyone's fucking freezing all the time. I love it. And guess what? I love mosquitoes. I love the bull. That's how you know you're
Well,
Canadians. Like I like the bullshit about this country.
this is not like this is the other thing people who live outside of Canada don't appreciate. It's not just that it's cold. All the other seasons suck too.
Yeah, there's no good. How about there's no good season? How about
Yeah.
you're not Canadian unless you're complaining about the weather, and that's
There's
good.
there's winter, there's black fly season. There's a couple of really nice weeks in July,
Yeah,
and then it's like, what's wrong with fall in this country? Well, it's rainy all the time and it's dark.
yeah. It's a lot like Britain minus that like nice jet stream that kind of brings in it just kind of sucks. And then
Yeah,
there's weeds, but you know what? I like it. I wouldn't be anywhere else. I wouldn't. My mind wouldn't work anywhere else.
that's right. This is my home. God, you know, uh, despite all of these things. Um, but it's not theirs. And if especially as things, there's a vast number of migrants to Canada that come from the Indian subcontinent, and things are a lot better economically there than they were in, say, the 80s. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to just go back.
Yeah. Well, it's like I was whenever you look at like people living in Afghanistan, you know, these tribal people, I'm like, you're never gonna love anything as much as these motherfuckers love sand. They love
Yeah,
sand.
exactly.
They get sand. I don't get sand. It's confusing to me. It's bothersome, but they're at peace with it. And like me with snow, I get
Yeah.
snow.
Yeah, I don't have a snowblower. I move it by hand.
Yeah.
Um,
How about I don't move it? How about I leave it as is where it
and
belongs?
and drive over top of
Yeah,
it.
and if I can't do it, then I guess I'm not going anywhere today. I guess we're eating stuff.
Yeah, well, I was explaining to Radlib, who I podcast with pretty regularly, that there's a line in Canada when you go north above which people just don't shovel snow.
Yeah,
It just
they just drink. They just like
yeah
that's the way because the snow can't be shoveled. It's almost too cold.
yeah.
Uh, anyway, we got to get going now. I got a crying baby in the background here.
All
I
right,
don't know if anyone could hear, but I want to let people know once again. Check out the Red Ensign. That's the Red Ensign.substack.com. There's a bunch of articles on there about Canadian history that I'm a big fan of. And also be sure to check out the Beowulf Foundation. Beowulf.foundation is the site where you can get access to the shielding stuff. It's a nice portal for everything. You can learn more about it. And was there anything else that you were involved in that I might have missed?
no, if you follow my Twitter, you'll find all the stuff I'm involved in.
Yes, and so the Black Horse. Let me just make sure I got the right at here. Yeah, that's at the Black Horse 65 is where you can find all
That's
that information.
that's right.
We follow each other. We're good friends. Go be his friend too. All right. Thank you once again very much for taking the time. I actually learned quite a bit today. I didn't know most of what you had said. I found this very, very illuminating. Thank you again.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.